Oh, good evening, everyone. My name's John Highbush. I have the honor of being the executive director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation. I want to thank all of you for coming out this evening in honor of our men and women in uniform who protect our freedoms around the world. If you would please stand and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Please be seated. Well, it is a pleasure to share a moment this evening with an authentic radio personality. Because as you all hopefully may know, like our special guest, Ronald Reagan made his mark in radio, but a little before you, Michael, back in 1932. We also know that President Reagan took to the radio again in 1975 after leaving the governor's office in Sacramento. He first turned down a TV deal with CBS News in which they wanted to pit him against Eric Sevareid in a point-counterpoint type of a show. Instead, President Reagan opted for the intimacy of radio where he felt he could clearly express his ideas. He did that for the next 5 years, delivering over 1,000 radio addresses to a national audience. From there, he went on to become the President of the United States. I think this was a testament in part to the power of radio then and now, the medium that Michael has occupied so well for so many years. When looking over Michael's new book, which you can buy right outside here or up in the store if you haven't gotten it yet, I really think you should, The American Miracle, I was reminded of one of my favorite speeches of President Reagan. It was at a commencement address in the summer of 1952 when he spoke at William Woods College in Fulton, Missouri, the same town where Winston Churchill had warned that a Soviet Iron Curtain had descended across the European continent. In the speech, President Reagan said he believed, quote, that God, in shedding his grace on this country, has always, in this divine scheme of things, kept an eye on our land and guided it as a promised land. So this Reagan thought became a theme. Indeed, it became a call for fire. President Reagan lit the match that started the fire that would eventually see the Iron Curtain go up in flames. This American exceptionalism was how Ronald Reagan viewed our nation, its place in the world and in history. He called it a rendezvous with destiny. When I read Michael's book about divine providence in the rise of the Republic, I was reminded that he believes, like Ronald Reagan, there's a reason for most things. In one scenario in his book, he asked the reader to consider the plight of a band of desperate religious refugees who find themselves blown hopelessly off course only to be deposited at the one spot on a wild continent best suited for their survival. This example and many others that Michael has written about mirror some of the essential beliefs of Ronald Reagan, that events have occurred in some way according to a master plan, guided and administered by a force of divine providence. Here's one other comparison. Our special guest and author, like Ronald Reagan, traveled the road from liberalism to conservatism. In his education while at Yale Law School, Michael's classmates were Bill and Hillary Clinton. After law school, I don't know if you heard Michael, he said they've been retired. After law school, at the age of 26, Michael published his first bestseller, What Really Happened to the Class of '65, a skeptical reconsideration of the counterculture of the 1960s. That book was Michael's first. He has since authored 12 more books. It is my great honor to welcome a very nimble thinker, a dynamic radio personality, a superb writer, and author of a book that reflects, as President Reagan would suggest, to leave the rest to God. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to the stage Mr. Michael Medved.
Thank you so much, John. Thank you for the very warm words and the kind introduction. And it is an honor that I cannot exaggerate for me to be here kicking off this book at the Reagan Library. I just want everybody to understand it's a big moment for anybody. I mean, it's my 13th book, but still, every new venture like this is so exciting. This is the very first day that any human being has actually physically bought a copy of this book. And the very first review came out today. It's posted at our website at michaelmedved.com. It's a good review. I wouldn't post it if it weren't. And it's really a wonderful feeling to have all of that happen here. I broadcast from here live today, as some of you know. I know some of you were here live when I was broadcasting today. And it really struck me, and I almost lost it, because during the very first break, there was the first individual who came up and put the book in front of me, and I signed, and it was for Benjamin, and I remember that because I have a brother, Benjamin. I have a brother, Harry, also, who's right here with us tonight. But in any event, thank you for applauding my brother. So it just hit me. This is wonderful. I'm at the Ronald Reagan Library, and I'm signing the very first copy of my book. I don't even have copies that I've given to my children or my wife because they hadn't sent them yet, but they got here. The book is formally published November 29th. And yes, it's associated with Thanksgiving, because that desperate band of religious refugees that John alluded to were the Pilgrims, right? And they weren't aiming for Massachusetts. They had a contract and a grant to Manhattan. Can you imagine how different American history would be if William Bradford and the Pilgrims had ended up on Manhattan Island instead of the Dutch, who had a much more relaxed attitude, well, kind of to most things? In any event, the story of how they found the right place where they wouldn't starve to death or freeze to death, and the fact that they actually were 250 miles off course from where they were supposed to be. And when you're talking about transportation in 1620 in November, where there's ice everywhere. I mean, it's Massachusetts. You don't want to go to Massachusetts in November, really. The story is remarkable. But there's a remarkable story right here at the Reagan Library, and I had the opportunity to tour the museum and the library a little bit earlier today. And again, it indicates one of the reasons that President Reagan was so conscious of providence as a force in his life. In May of 1981, he had just won a landslide victory as president. He'd begun his presidency. He's coming out of the Washington Hilton Hotel. Someone calls out, President Reagan, President Reagan. He raises his left arm, and a bullet enters on the left side. And the bullet came within a fraction of an inch of piercing the president's heart lining. The story is remarkable. because the initial decision had been he has to go back to the White House. They didn't know how grievously the president had been wounded. If they hadn't taken him directly to the hospital instead, President Reagan would have been lost. We would have never had a Reagan revolution. And it's an astonishing story, and President Reagan wrote in his diary that after that experience, he knew that he owed his life to God and never forgot it. What I would like to do is speak to you about a couple of distantly related stories of people that I write about in my book who escaped death. I don't write about President Reagan in this book. He's the subject, and his assassination attempt is a subject of the next book, which is called This Favored Land, which follows the period after the Civil War. What I want to talk about with you is George Washington, Andrew Jackson, Sam Houston, and Abraham Lincoln. Very briefly, and then I want to open it up to your questions about some of the themes and some of the facts in the book concerning divine providence and the shaping of this country. One of the reasons I decided to do this book is I was preparing one of my American history programs, which we do on CD and MP3 download, medvedhistorystore.com. That's a shameless plug. But we've done a total of, it's actually 23 different programs of about almost 3 hours each on the American Revolution. That's a lot of talking about the Revolution. But one of the things that is always knocked me out is the indestructibility and seeming invulnerability of this man named George Washington. And his contemporaries marveled at it. Brief story. Colonel Washington is a 23-year-old militia colonel. He became a 23-year-old militia colonel because basically he had inherited the position from his brother Lawrence, who was like a father to him, and his brother had died of smallpox. And by the way, Mount Vernon was originally his brother's estate. In any event, 23-year-old militia colonel rides off with a British army toward the end of 1754, the very beginning of the French and Indian War. Some of you who are history buffs may have heard of Braddock's defeat. To this day, the history books of British Army story, it is the worst, the most ignominious defeat, second to one. We'll get to that one in a moment. In the entire history of British arms, up to that time, the British Army had never suffered a comparable disaster. They rode right into an ambush of a few French troops and a great many Indians. They were called Indians at that time. I guess you could call them now Native Americans, though a bunch of them had come down from Canada to help their French allies. What happened is there were 70 American and English officers who rode into battle. 69 were wounded or killed. The majority of officers and non-commissioned officers died at the Battle of Monongahela. George Washington is a big target. He's 6'3" at a time when the average British fighting man is about 5'6". He stood out. He is riding on very big horses because those are the only kind of horses that can carry someone who is 6'3", and everyone described him as a magnificent specimen. He rides into battle. His first horse is shot out from under him. He gets on a second horse. His hat is shot off his head. 3 different bullets pierce his clothes. The clothes survived. He remains untouched. He comes back to talk about this defeat. He tries to rescue General Braddock, his commander, who was also grievously wounded and also dies. But when he came back, Samuel Davies, who was one of the leading Presbyterian clerics of the time, later became president of Princeton University. Samuel Davies, close to Washington's birthday, delivers a sermon in which he says, "I admire the martial fire of that magnificent youth, Colonel Washington, and I cannot but doubt, I cannot doubt, pardon me, that Providence has preserved him so that he will serve some singular purpose as leader of our people." He's 23 years old. Okay, it's astonishing. And by the way, this record continued during the Revolutionary War, and I tell the stories in the book. There is one close scrape after another. There's the story of Patrick Ferguson, who was the most famous marksman in the British Army. He had done displays for King George, and he designed what was called Ferguson's rifles, which are considered the most efficient rifles of the time. Patrick Ferguson, before the Battle of Brandywine outside Philadelphia, sees George Washington, and he is together in a tree with 3 other snipers, the best shots in the British Army. They take him in their sights. They ask then Captain Ferguson, "Should we shoot?" He says, "Do not shoot that noble figure." He said afterward, and he was interviewed about it, he later died in battle in the later stages of the American Revolution. He said afterward, "Didn't you know that that was General Washington?" And he says, "I would prefer not to have killed under those circumstances." And he claims, of course, he did not know it was Washington. Another episode, and it's extraordinary. Before the Battle of Monongahela, when Washington is 22, he's doing this epic journey to Pittsburgh, which is Fort Duquesne at the time, to basically tell the French to get out of town. That ended up provoking the war. He is coming back. His raft capsizes. He falls into this frozen river, the Monongahela River, and it's terrible and it's cold. And in any event, at one point, he and the one other person who was accompanying him pick up an Indian guide. The Indian guide says, "Here, you guys are lugging, I will carry your musket for you." The Indian guide then turns the musket, and they estimate it 6 to 8 feet away, and fires at George Washington. And as I say in the book, it's one of those things where they haven't made a movie of this. They should, because I can see the movie. And in the movie, you see the bullet in slow motion passing through time and eternity. And if that bullet does not miss its mark, and it did, there's no United States of America as we know it. Because we're talking about the one indispensable figure in all of American life. He is president of the Constitutional Convention, which is a miracle all its own. That's a chapter in the book. And it is extraordinary. And time after time after time, he is preserved, and Americans knew it. Another story. Andrew Jackson is a controversial figure. I was pleased to see that in the replica of President Reagan's Oval Office, there's a portrait of Andrew Jackson. So he can't be that controversial. But the first review of my book, which I'm very grateful for, their only reservation, the only negative note was, well, Medved seems to be entirely too positive toward Andrew Jackson. Because Andrew Jackson had a crucial role in American history, which I will explain to you, which occurred before he was president. But Jackson had this same ability as Washington of basically dodging death again and again. And like Washington, he was aware of it. And he had determined that he had been spared for some providential reason. When he is 13 years old, he is already fighting in the Revolutionary War against the British. A British captain asks young Andy to shine his boots. Jackson declines the honor. And the British officer then raises his saber and brings it down on the head of the 13-year-old boy. Jackson raises his arm. He has scars on his arm for the rest of his life from where the saber hit. And it hit his arm, and then it hit his forehead and nearly kills him. He's bleeding. He nearly dies. Okay, he also fought a lot of duels, let's face it. And he got involved. He carried with him permanently 2 different bullets from 2 different, well, one from a duel, one from a brawl. Okay, the brawl is what I'm interested in. Because it's a nasty tavern brawl, and it's really, really stupid. Jackson loved dueling. And he fought a duel against a guy named John Dickinson. They had a dispute over a horse race, and then John Dickinson said something unpleasant about Jackson's wife, Rachel. Jackson challenged him to the field of honor. Jackson allowed Mr. Dickinson to fire first. Mr. Dickinson placed the bullet directly above General Jackson's heart. At this time, by the way, Andrew Jackson is a senator, U.S. senator from Tennessee. He was a senator, he was a congressman, he was in charge of the Tennessee militia with the rank of general. He's a substantial guy. He staggers for a moment. You would too if you just took a bullet in the heart. Then he carefully aims his pistol and he kills the other guy. Okay, this was a very tough customer. He's involved in another duel with some subordinates of his and against 2 very good friends of his. There are 2 brothers, Thomas Hart Benton and Jesse Benton. They're all together in the frontier in Nashville, Tennessee, which is the frontier. It's wild. Sort of like Dodge City. I mean, if things are going on, they're wild. What happened is that Jesse Benton is fighting a duel with this other subordinate in the militia to General Jackson. And Jesse Benton got the worst of the duel, and he took a bullet in a very unpleasant place, his backside. And that's considered to be the ultimate humiliation. And the ultimate humiliation, because if they hit you there, it means you turned your back on your opponent, and you're not supposed to do that. You're supposed to do what Jackson did, which is stand there bleeding and then fire back. In any event, Jesse Benton is humiliated. Apparently, Jackson shares in the humiliation. Jackson wasn't involved in the duel. He was the second. He was the assistant to the person who shot Jesse Benton. But in any event, Jesse Benton then says that Jackson is a cad because Jackson allowed his partner to cheat and to fire first before he should, and Jackson is a blackguard. So Jackson is furious, and he says, I would horsewhip that man if I could. He rides into Nashville with a few friends to pick up his mail at the City Hotel. And outside the bar of the City Hotel, he sees this Jesse Benton with his brother Tom. Jackson dismounts, takes out a horsewhip and a cane, and then proceeds to approach Jesse Benton to knock the out of him. Okay, this is all really very important in American history. I'm telling you, this is a nasty little brawl, but it goes, okay, the brawl is horrible. People are shot. There's blood everywhere. Thomas Hart Benton, who later becomes the most influential U.S. senator and a great ally of Jackson, shoots General Jackson. He is being shot at from every direction. He absorbs a couple of bullets and one that everyone assumes is fatal. He is rushed back to the Hermitage, to his home. The surgeons gather around a bed. He has lost a great deal of blood. In fact, they had to move him from beds because he had soaked through with blood, not just the sheets, but the bed itself. And he's delirious, and the surgeons say to Mrs. Jackson, who is tearful and watching her husband expire, the surgeon says to Mrs. Jackson, we have to amputate his right arm, otherwise he will not survive. There is no possibility. And she says, are you certain? They said, we are as certain as death. And so they then take out their tools. They prepare to remove his right arm. Jackson, who had bright blue eyes like Bunsen burners, everybody talked about how piercing his blue eyes were, all of a sudden opens his eyes as they're getting ready to saw, and he says, "I'll keep the arm, thank you." They try to reason with them, and in his delirious state, with the eyes closed again, he threatens to kill anyone who makes an approach to his arm. So the doctors think better of it because it's Andrew Jackson who's talking. And a month later, he's lost 30 pounds. Jackson is about 6'1". He weighs at this point about 115 pounds. He is a stick. And he is called to lead the militia into history. They had to tie him to his horse, he was so weak. But he had kept his arm, and he rides into battle. And he wins one of the greatest military victories in all of American history in New Orleans on January 8th, 1815. Now, the Battle of New Orleans, it is not believable when you read about it. It is so clearly irrational. No individual looking at that battle today, and there are historians, very cold, calculating historians, inexplicable casualty figures. Total British casualties, as they were planning to seize the entire Mississippi Valley and make it permanently part of the British Empire. Total British casualties, 2,037. Total American dead, 7. Okay, this is not normal. And Jackson himself writes about this, and by the way, there's more to this story, and this is the kind of thing that has been excised from most history books because it's too preposterous and too bizarre, but I went back to the original sources, and it's real. It is real. There's a group of nuns, the Ursulines, in New Orleans. They established the first convent anywhere in North America. They build this beautiful convent. They bring in a statue of the Blessed Virgin, and they believe that that is why their convent is the only building, it is still the oldest building in the Mississippi Valley. The building still exists. Their convent was spared in the fire because they prayed to this statue of the Blessed Virgin, and who became known as Our Lady of Perpetual Succor, and they pray to her at moments of great need. The British are approaching New Orleans. The nuns fast and pray all night long before the battle. And the Americans are completely outnumbered. The Americans are called dirty shirts. That's what the Redcoats called them. These Brits are led by the Duke of Wellington's brother-in-law, Sir Edward Pakenham. They're called Wellington's heroes. They are incredibly confident. They have a perfect plan. They are assaulting from two sides, the American lines at Line Jackson. The nuns are praying away. And the Mother Superior says that if you will grant that noble General Jackson the victory, we will make this day, January 8th, a perpetual celebration day in honor of Our Lady of Blessed Succor. In any event, the next day is Sunday. As they are celebrating Mass, the battle occurs. The battle took 18 minutes. And again, the British are totally shattered. This is the single worst defeat in the history of the British Army. And by the way, they discovered in the 200th anniversary of the battle, which was last year, right? There was original research that was done. What people hear about the Battle of New Orleans regularly is it didn't matter, because the battle happened after peace had been signed in Europe. News didn't travel at that time. They had signed the Treaty of Ghent. John Quincy Adams negotiated it in Belgium with the British. So peace had already been made. Who cares about New Orleans? Well, Americans care deeply because it gave them a sense that this War of 1812 in which they're engaged had not been a complete waste and a complete disaster. It ended with this great American victory, but it's more than that. They found in the War Department classified information, and it's published now. You can see it. I cite it in my book. That the British intention was, whether there was peace or not, if they seized the Mississippi Valley, they were going to keep it. And what you are talking about is the Louisiana Territory, which is 15 states of the United States. Yeah, General Jackson surviving that brawl in Nashville made a huge, huge difference. And one more story. When General Jackson was dying, he never had a son of his own. But he had a number of people who were like sons to him. One of them, by the way, one of the things that people say against Jackson is that he was a racist, he was horrible. He adopted a Creek Indian boy whose mother had been killed in conflict. And he adopted the boy at age 3, and he raised him, and he died tragically when he was 16. But he didn't have a son of his own. Closest thing he ever had to a son was a young man named Sam Houston, who had lost his father when he was just a child, and Jackson became like his father. And Sam Houston fought with General Jackson at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, where he was wounded, and he rushed at the very end of the general's life because Sam Houston, late in life, had become a father for the first time, and he wanted to take his son, Sam Houston Jr., to see General Jackson, who had been President Jackson, who was finally dying, and it's 1845, and Sam Houston is trying to bring him, and he just missed. But there is almost an apostolic succession. Okay, the story of Sam Houston, which is also a big focus of the book, is so remarkable and so cinematic. I swear you're going to read this in the American Miracle, and you're going to think, Medved, you're making this stuff up. I'm not. It's all true. It's the most bizarre thing. Sam Houston is supposed to succeed Andrew Jackson as president. They're both from Tennessee. Sam Houston is elected governor of Tennessee when he's 33. He is widely talked about in press accounts of all the time, the next president, Governor Houston. Only one thing lacking. He didn't have a wife. And there weren't any Slovenian models to import, so he needed... he needed to find a wife. He finds the perfect wife. Her family is deeply involved in politics in the region. She is incredibly beautiful. They get married. It is a wedding with all the dignitaries in the state. The governor is getting married. He is more popular than ever. Something went terribly wrong at the wedding night. There are about 7 different theories about what it was. Houston never said. But one of the things that his wife said is that Houston could not perform the role of a husband. Now, that was contradicted because he later had 8 children. So, in any event, his young, beautiful wife deserts him a month after their wedding. He is so humiliated at the time, he resigns as governor, runs off to the Cherokees. He had become an adopted Cherokee earlier. He runs off to the Cherokees in this reservation that he had helped to establish and begins drinking heavily. He, in fact, receives the Indian name, which is not flattering. It's translated, I can't pronounce Cherokee, but they called him Big Drunk. He was reputed to be, some people said 6'6". Most historians think he was shorter than that, but he was a big, big guy, another big guy. In any event, he is drinking, he is in trouble. He is then accused by a congressman back home in a previous role that he had in U.S. Congress of stealing money. Houston comes back to Washington to visit with President Jackson, who's president of the United States at the time, his former commander, his acting father, And this congressman is a great big Jabba the Hutt kind of guy. There's only one photograph of William Stanbury, and he looks like he's just eaten the rest of the caucus in the House of Representatives. He's a congressman from Ohio. He's accused Sam Houston of all these terrible things about stealing money from the Indians he was supposed to be serving and working with. In any event, Stanbury is walking out of the House of Representatives, and Houston, following the Jacksonian example, comes after him. He has taken a hickory stick that he got from Jackson's home at the Hermitage, and he takes the hickory stick, and he says, "You, sir, are a cad, sir. Will you not fight me on the field of honor?" And Stanbury says, "Of course not. I'm from Ohio." And so Sam Houston, who's from Tennessee and has just been living with the Indians, and he's dressed in moccasins, and he's dressed in buckskin, and he's dressed in Indian garb, and dressed like a Cherokee, he takes this big hickory stick and starts whacking him and whacking him and whacking him. And Stanbury is carrying 2 loaded pistols. He takes the loaded pistol. It has 2 chambers. He puts it against, Sam Houston's on top of him, and this is a big mountain of a guy. He takes the pistol and fires it directly into Sam Houston's heart. 2 misfires. Okay, Houston was preoccupied with being spared death. What happens is he ends up with virtually everything going wrong in his life and a major drinking problem. Davy Crockett, you probably know, said to his opponents, he was another Tennessee politician and a friend of Sam Houston's. He said, "As for you gentlemen, you may all go to hell. I am going to Texas." And went off to Texas, as Sam Houston did. Sam Houston wins the Battle of San Jacinto. He commands the Texas forces. Without Sam Houston, there is no Texas as part of the United States. Because again, it is one of the stories, the Battle of San Jacinto, which, like the Battle of New Orleans that his mentor fought, it is completely inexplicable. And he captures the president of Mexico and forces him to sign a treaty recognizing the independence of Texas, and becomes the first president of Texas. And then, by the way, a U.S. senator who late in life has a Christian conversion, and this family, and heroically opposes secession because he loves America. Now, why do I mention all of this? Because it's all cinematic, and it's all dramatic, and it's all inexplicable. These men were needed. Yes, they were all military heroes, but they all dodged death repeatedly. God was using them for a purpose. Final story, and I want to do this very quickly and then open it up to your calls. You can call me right here. Final story and final question. The last 3 chapters of The American Miracle are about Abraham Lincoln. Because some people say that the president-elect, who, by the way, had a very good day today, and I think is, I, as probably many of you know, I've been very, very skeptical about Mr. Trump, but I think he is in the process of transforming himself and transforming the situation and rising to the occasion in a magnificent way, announcing that he is meeting with Mitt Romney, that he is considering Nikki Haley, that he is reaching out for people who've been critical of him. This is, you will see, it is a characteristic of all of these people that we talk about playing a role, a crucial role in the building and saving of America, turning enemies into friends. It's easy to turn friends into enemies. It's tough to turn enemies into friends. In any event, people say of Mr. Trump, he is the most unlikely person ever to become president. No, he isn't. Donald Trump is famous. Whether he won or lost, whether he ran for president or not, he'd be in the history books. He is a famous, powerful individual. If Abraham Lincoln had not run for president, if he had not won the Republican nomination, you never would have heard of him. He was a one-term congressman from southern Illinois. Very little more pathetic than being a one-term congressman. That's 2 years in Washington. You talk about outsider. And Abraham Lincoln, a total education of at most 6 months in classrooms in his entire life. His rise to the presidency is a miracle. It is a story that depends on so many coincidences and so many things going right. So the question becomes, with all of these miracles surrounding Lincoln and the discovery of 3 cigars in an open field that allowed him to emancipate the slaves, what do the cigars have to do with the slaves? You have to read the book. The question is, why is he killed? We're talking about God in his plans for America, sparing George Washington and sparing Andrew Jackson and sparing Sam Houston, sparing Ronald Reagan later. Why allow our most valuable American of any American at the moment when he is needed most to bind up the wounds? Why allow him to be killed on Good Friday of 1865? On Palm Sunday of 1865, the South surrenders. Appomattox was on Palm Sunday. That's when Lee surrendered to Grant. There are celebrations in Washington. And then, 5 days after these happy moments, President Lincoln is killed. Why? How? The amazing aspect of this is that people at the time understood it and wrote about it. And obviously the fact that Lincoln, who had so many amazingly admirable human qualities, the question, as I argue in the book, is not why was he taken, it's how was he spared. There were at least a dozen prior assassination attempts, some of them very serious. He had a stovepipe hat that had a bullet shot through it when he was riding back on his horse, which was called Old Abe, to the soldiers' home in Washington where he stayed during the summer. There are these well-documented plots, one of them involving John Wilkes Booth, to kill or kidnap President Lincoln. Security was virtually non-existent. And the answer, it seems to me, is something that Lincoln understood. He had a task. He saw himself and repeatedly said in his speeches and his private letters he was an instrument of the divine will. His task was to save the Union. The Union was saved, and 5 days later, he was taken. And the fascinating aspect of his premonitions of his own death and him speaking about his own death before it happened are truly chilling and eerie and remarkable. So let me leave you with that. The Hebrew word in biblical Hebrew for an angel is malach. And a malach literally means a messenger. In Jewish tradition, and I think in biblical tradition, the view of angels is they have one task. You are sent on one mission, and then you leave. And in that sense, people who saw an angelic presence with Lincoln's rescue of this country may have had a deeper understanding of why he passed when he did. All of this goes to a basic choice that we have. We have a choice whether to celebrate our history and to feel gratitude or guilt. And it's going to be one or the other. We are such a lucky and fortunate, amazingly blessed people. If you do not accept the idea that we have been the tremendous beneficiaries of an incredibly generous deity. If one does not recognize that, if one does not see that, you are left to feel, well, how did America get to be the dominant power in the world from starting from nowhere? And you're left with either two choices. Either we are guilty, 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 we are rapacious, we rape the landscape. Today I had a caller from Las Vegas, Amy from Las Vegas, who called and said, America's a rapist. I said, who do we rape? We rape the earth, okay? You believe that America is the most guilty country in the world, which, by the way, raises real questions. Why aren't countries that behave far worse than America, like Spain, why aren't they comparably successful if that's the path to success? Or it's just a pattern of happy accidents. Well, guess what? A pattern of happy accidents is still a pattern. And what my book argues is there is only one intelligent conclusion one can make when looking at the history of this great country, which is that there is intelligent design. We're not going to get into evolution tonight, but there is intelligent design of American history. We are where we are and what we are because of a divine planner. Let us remain worthy of those gifts. With that, let me open it up to your questions.
And we've got a few minutes for questions. If you'll just raise your hand if you have one, and you can see we have staff in the aisles with microphones. If you could just wait until they put the mic in your hand so we can hear you, it'd be great. We'll start right here. Oh.
I assume you're referring to the Benton brothers?
Yes.
When he moved to Illinois?
Yes, the Benton brothers, Jesse and Thomas Hart Benton. Thomas Hart Benton became, Jackson carried the rest of his life Thomas Hart Benton's bullet in his body. They never got the bullet out because they kept the arm. They wanted to take the arm out, that would have gotten the bullet out. And Thomas Hart Benton became the greatest legislative ally of President Jackson. These two enemies who had shot at each other became stout friends and political allies. Now wait, there's more. I didn't do this. At the City Hotel in Nashville, when this brawl occurs, when Jackson takes the bullet in his body, he almost dies, and they almost amputate his arm. There is a guy there with his new baby and his wife. The guy's name is Charles Fremont, okay? He has a little baby, and he's witnessed this fight involving Senator Benton. Never saw Senator Benton again because Charles Fremont died. His baby is named John Charles Fremont, who later becomes the first Republican candidate for president and marries the daughter of Thomas Hart Benton, who was wounded in this brawl that his father was at the hotel. Now, you want to tell me that this isn't sort of arranged by some script writer who is writing something very bizarre? Now, this is not rumor, it's not legend, it's not tall tales, it's the record.
Right here.
Wonderful job, Mr. Medved.
Thank you.
Enjoyed every minute of it. My question is, the young people today just really don't know much about what happened and how America came about. And what can be done to turn that around?
It's a great question, and I'll tell you, there's one thing above all. Don't teach them American history to make them feel guilty. Don't emphasize all of the terrible things about America. America's had problems. We have done terrible things in the past, it's true. But the overwhelming history of this country is glorious. It is noble. It is exciting. And it is godly. And on this, I have to give all credit to my wonderful father. May he rest in peace. My father was the child of immigrants. He didn't even speak English, really, until he was 5 or 6. I mean, he grew up in a Yiddish-speaking home. South Philadelphia. My grandfather was a barrel maker. My father was the first member of his family born in the United States. He had 6 sisters. older sisters who died in Russia. My father is born in America, and he always said that was the greatest gift. That was the American miracle. That his mother, at age 48, was able to reunite with his father, and my father was able to be born. And my dad, we grew up in Philadelphia. My dad, when I was a little boy, started taking me to Independence Hall and Valley Forge. And what my dad said to me is to get me interested in history. He didn't say, you know, this is where those horrible slave owners and plantation owners and exploiters were terrible hypocrites because they wrote the Declaration of Independence and they still held slaves. Well, most of them didn't. Most of them didn't, by the way. And some of them were already active in anti-slavery activities, like Benjamin Franklin and Alexander Hamilton and John Adams. But in any event, that's the necessity of showing American history as inspiring and positive and joyous and good, not as something that you want to apologize for.
Thanks.
Over here.
Hi, Michael. Thank you for being here. I love and always have your passion for history.
Thank you.
It's infectious. Just to ask you to elaborate a little bit, if you would, I know this is a big topic, about how Lincoln embraced his enemies to help his presidency succeed.
But he not only embraced his enemies, he embraced the enemy, because he acknowledged that we had to become one country again. The stories that you have heard, perhaps I hope you've heard them, about Lincoln regularly. He went over papers every day, and almost every day he would pardon some poor young man who had tried to desert from the Union Army. He hated the idea of killing our own men, because desertion was a capital offense at the time. But the main thing that he did, and it's something that we're seeing right now with Donald Trump, and this is not, God forbid, to compare Donald Trump to Lincoln, but I think he's learning from Lincoln. I think he's learning from Lincoln, I do. Because what Lincoln did, when Lincoln won the presidency, and the story's in my book, when Lincoln won the presidency, he ran against some pretty tough political hombres, right? Remember when Mr. Trump said tough hombres and he got in trouble? Okay. William Henry Seward, tough hombre. Salmon Portland Chase, tough hombre. Don Simon Cameron, tough hombre. Edward Bates, tough hombre. So what do? You put him in your cabinet. That's exactly what Lincoln did. He takes his main opponent, who was heartbroken that Lincoln had beaten him at the Republican convention because of, again, inexplicable factors. You'll find it in the book. But he takes Seward, his main opponent, Secretary of State, his second main opponent, Secretary of Treasury, third main opponent, Secretary of War, that's Simon Cameron, and then Edward Bates, his opponent from Missouri, a former slaveholder, he appoints as his Attorney General. Okay, takes a former Democrat, not a former Democrat, a Democrat, Gideon Welles of Connecticut, as the Secretary of the Navy. Now, all these people, except for Cameron, who leaves quickly and is replaced by Edwin Stanton, another Democrat that Lincoln brings in, these people performed magnificently. And the point is, their personal devotion to Lincoln is extraordinary. One of the secrets for Lincoln's success was, there's a very interesting book which I cite by Joshua Wolf-Shank, I cite considerably in my book, which has to do with Lincoln's clinical depression. And he did have depression. He had serious episodes. Today, he would probably be medicated out of greatness. But part of his bond with people was that they saw that this was a man of sorrows. And is that a biblical phrase from both Old and New Testament? Yes, it is. Let me take, if I can, just a couple of more questions.
Right over here.
Thank you, Michael. You're a national treasure, and we're very happy to have you here. I'm wondering, do you think there's anything that we're doing that puts us at risk of God's continued providence? Or conversely, what can we do to be worthy of his continued providence?
I'm almost tempted to pull an Obama on this and to say, that question is above my pay grade. And do you remember when President Obama said that? It was a question about with Rick Warren. Look, here's my assumption. I believe Benjamin Franklin, one of my favorite Franklin quotes, once said that beer is proof that God loves his children and wants them to be happy. And by the way, this is something I found out doing this book. These guys could drink. Not Lincoln. He was a teetotaler. And because his father had problems with it. But the one thing that I would say is that if you assume that God loves his children, and I think most Christians and Jews do, then clearly America is a tremendous agency for redemption for the whole world. I quote one of the leading American historians of the moment, Walter McDougall, who's a professor emeritus at University of Pennsylvania, my father's alma mater. And Professor McDougall says, the emergence of the United States of America is by far the most significant event of the last 500 years. And when you think about it, it's true. And in that regard, I am not sure that God is rewarding and punishing as the prophets say he did with ancient Israel. I think that God is using. And it is our job, my understanding, to allow ourselves to be used in the right way, to try to discern. I quote Otto von Bismarck in my book, and it's a wonderful quote. He says, "It is the job of the statesman to see where fate and God are passing, and then to try to grab onto the coattails and follow." I think that's profound. And I think that's what we have to do. And seize those chances for redemption that are offered to us. And those chances are perpetual. President Reagan saw that. Who would have believed in 1980, in November of 1980, when he won that landslide victory, that we could have mourning in America in the next 4 years? That the mood of the country could be turned around. That the realities of our political system, of our economic system, of the world competition with communism, anyone who bets against America, in my previous book, The 10 Big Lies About America, big lie number 10 is the lie that says that America is in intractable, irredeemable moral decline. Nothing is impossible for Americans. Let me take 2 more questions.
Okay, right over here.
Hello, Michael. Okay, your book talks about God's providence in American history. Can you think of any examples of God's providence in world history where America was greatly involved in, like maybe the 2 world wars, or like any events that like evolved the rest of the world, but America was a big player in?
Yes, of course. And I would say that the 2 biggest events in which America was the big player were, in fact, World War II and the Cold War. Because without the United States of America, and again, I apply what I call the Bedford Falls test on this. Do people know what I'm referring to with Bedford Falls? One of the greatest movies ever made, of course, is It's a Wonderful Life. And what George Bailey has to see is what Bedford Falls, his little town, would have been like if he hadn't existed. Try to imagine what the world would be like today if America didn't exist. The only question is, would we be suffering under world Nazi tyranny or world communist tyranny? That is like choosing between cancer and a heart attack. It's a horrible, horrible choice. And there is no possibility of defeating world communism, which claimed over 100 million victims in the 20th century before it was done. There is no possible chance that we are successful in that endeavor as humanity without the United States of America. One of the things, and again, this book covers 1588, first serious attempt at settling the New World, through Lincoln's death in 1865. The second volume, which I'm supposed to be writing now, but I'm talking to you. The second volume, which will be called This Favored Land, which was a phrase that Lincoln used repeatedly and Jackson used. This Favored Land covers 1865 through the present day. And one of the things, and it's again, it's completely inexplicable, the best book about the Battle of Midway. Do people here know about the Battle of Midway? Okay. Battle of Midway really is the most decisive battle of World War II. By the time of Normandy, which is also very important, also a great story, but by that time, basically the tide of war had turned. It is deeply questionable whether we're going to be able to defend Hawaii and California from the Japanese before Midway. In 3 minutes and 50 seconds, one squadron of planes sank 3 Japanese aircraft carriers and severely crippled a 4th. That was the Japanese fleet. In 3 minutes and 50 seconds, no one can explain it. And the men who came back, who were flying on this one mission, still looked at it with wonderment. The lucky hits, I mean, the success in the midst of this battle, and again, this is in the new book, not in this one. So you talk about America's redemption. When you read about the monstrous cruelty, it's often easier to recognize profound evil than profound goodness, partially because the ultimate goodness is resisting evil. And that's what America did with communism and with Nazism and Japanese militarism. Last question.
Going right over here.
First of all, thank you so much for your kindness as you handled the disagreeable people on your radio program. There are many questions probably with us in terms of how is God using Trump and Pence, and could it very well be that he's using them to move the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem?
Possibly that, but I think possibly, let me conclude with this, and I was planning to actually go into more detail, but I won't, because I honestly am trying to come to terms with it, because it seems, just as Andrew Jackson is a very, very unlikely vessel, Mr. Trump is in many ways an unlikely vessel. However, there are a couple of things about his elevation, I want to mention 3 of them, that suggest what God may have in mind. Number 1, he ascends to the presidency with such low expectations from his critics and from that majority of Americans who'd never voted for him, because remember, if you count the people who didn't vote at all, who didn't bother to vote, we're talking about over 75% of Americans never voted for Trump. And most of those people look at him and expect nothing. So that when he does something good and decent, it's wonderful, it's liberating, the sun is shining. You know, he appoints Reince Priebus, right? White House Chief of Staff. I said, this is a miracle. Reince Priebus is a decent guy. Now, is there something particularly outstanding about Reince Priebus? He's a good guy. But you see, I think that will help his presidency and help him have a successful presidency in a way that George Bush and Barack Obama and Bill Clinton did not. Okay? I think it's possible that he will. That's one factor. The other factor is that there is such revulsion at the moment for the politics of personality, for the politics of personal destruction, to you are the most corrupt person to ever run for office, and you are have the worst temperament and the most erratic to ever run for office, and you're horrible, and no, you're worse, and yan, 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 your mother wears combat boots. I mean, it was pathetic to watch those debates. I'm thinking of Lincoln Douglas. I was reading through, at the time that the Republican debates were going on, I was still doing the book, and I was reading through transcripts of Lincoln and Douglas, and they're speaking to crowds of 30,000 people with no microphone. And by the way, you know, those were debates. Lincoln and Douglas, they're debating for the U.S. Senate in Illinois in 1858, and they're speaking to 30,000 people. You know what the ground rules were? First speaker speaks for 1 hour. Opening statement. Next speaker speaks for 90 minutes. And the final speaker speaks for the concluding 30 minutes. Okay, and what they said, because they took transcripts, it's brilliant. It's really substantive. It's amazing. We didn't have that. So you're laughing. Yeah, if somebody disagrees, these debates were Ciceronian. This was, no. Okay, so what's the advantage here? The advantage is that people, I think, are so tired of it, that these moves that Mr. Trump is making right now, to forget the terrible things that Romney has said about him and that he said about Romney. Remember, Romney's a loser, and he's a choker, and he isn't really a millionaire. And fine, now they're meeting. They're going to play golf tomorrow. No, pardon me, Saturday. They're getting together. Neither of them have to observe Shabbat, so that's fine. In any event, there is such revulsion to the personal nature of politics. I think if Mr. Trump can at all emphasize substance, positivity, common ground, what an opportunity. It's like bouncing off a trampoline. We're sort of way down, we've sunk down, so you can bounce up really high. And there's something finally here, which is, was this election really about ideology? I don't think it was. Nobody really knew what either Secretary Clinton or Mr. Trump was going to do as president. That leaves a great open area for consensus and for building American consensus, and particularly because we've had 8 years of, quote, hope and change. We've had 8 years of America to be moved to the left. Okay, the hope and change brigades, they may be very, very depressed right now because Mr. Trump won, but you know what? You had your 8 years. Now the other side has a chance, and probably we're going to go boom, boing, boink, and back to the center, which is where America usually is. And the ability of Mr. Trump to seize this opportunity to achieve consensus, compromise, some sense of shared Americanness, and you're right to mention Mike Pence because he's going to be a very big part of this. I think that ability is real. Now you could say, Donald Trump is going to achieve compromise and consensus and conciliation and reconciliation. You know what? Stranger things have happened in American life. You can read all about it in The American Miracle. Thank you very much for your attention and for coming to the Reagan Library.
Thank you, Michael.
2 minutes. Michael will meet you in the bookstore.